There are certain mistakes that learners make over and over again in the maths exams, and often in their assessments during the year. And as teachers, we need to know how do we guide the learners to make sure that they don't do this. So let's have a look at these common mistakes, and there are 5 in maths that often occur. The first is that learners don't demonstrate a level of understanding. Now let's have a look and see where the learners actually struggle. Often learners do not understand the question that is embedded in the language and fail to comprehend what is actually required of them. This is often due to poor literacy skills. They also don't know how to interpret the questions and information, and they don't know how to justify or give an explanation. Learners don't have the ability to respond to complex high-order questions, and often this ability is also lacking when they need to answer problem-solving questions. And finally, learners struggle to fully understand the different steps of logarithms. Now let's have a look at an example of this. In this question, which is taken from a mathematics previous exam paper, this particular question, the learners didn't understand what the question was actually asking of them. And you find this a lot in the maths paper. The next question, once again, the learners haven't grasped what the appropriate response to this question actually is. So they read it, but they don't actually understand what is required of them. Now, it's important for us to know, how do we help the learners through this? What can we do? The first is learners need to develop a glossary of all mathematical terminology used. And either you can develop this for them as a teacher and give it to them, or ideally, let them develop it themselves. The next is the interpretation of questions should form part of the teaching. Learners should be trained to interpret questions as they go along. So even their informal assessments should develop this skill. Learners should also be exposed to non-routine questions as regularly as possible. So don't always give them the predictable questions. Give them different and difficult questions that they haven't seen before. As a teacher and in our teaching, we must emphasize the importance of not just memorizing formulae, but also understanding the principles and the steps behind it. And then again, make sure learners have got a list of key words and explain to them what they mean. So in the exam paper, if they get a word such as analyze or compare or discuss or evaluate, they actually know what these words mean and what is expected of them. The next common mistake is that learners don't plan their answers. And this often comes from the fact that learners don't take the necessary steps to prepare successfully for their exam, and sometimes they don't know how to. Learners also do not answer the questions correctly, and they rely on content that previously has been tested, and then they just write this down in a different format. Learners are also very poor at reading the question correctly, and they become tuned into standard responses in certain questions and provide information without being specific as to what the actual question is asking. Now, how do we help these learners? What do we do? How can we provide support for them in the classroom and before the exam? We want to make sure that teachers don't rely purely on old exam papers, as this doesn't give them exposure to different and fresh questions from other sources. You also don't always want to give the memo, because with the revision papers, if the learners get the memo all the time, they don't attempt the questions, but they rather follow the steps in the memo, and then they don't understand the actual algorithms and so on that they have to put in. And it's really important that we emphasize the importance of planning to answer the question correctly. And most importantly, we need the learners to go into this exam where we've demonstrated them how to structure their answer correctly or effectively to get the marks that they actually require. The next common mistake is that learners aren't able to calculate. Now, you'd think in maths that this would be a simple thing, but really many learners get to grade 12 and they don't know the. When it comes to formulae, learners need to familiarize themselves with general formulae and the calculations that go hand in hand with these formulae. They need to be able to apply the correct formulae and also apply the formulae that they've learned in the proper question, in the correct context. But most importantly, they mustn't make mistakes that are unnecessary, and they must make sure that they use the correct substitutions into these formulae when they appear in the question paper. Now, how do we help the learners to do this? The first is learners should be familiar with formulae all the time and all the formulae. Provide the learners with a list of formulae so they can learn it before the time and they've got that list. Learners should practice applying the formulae to appropriate situations, And as teachers, we should emphasize the importance of becoming familiar with the procedures and the different steps of calculations. But most importantly, we need to emphasize the marks that they could lose unnecessarily if they're not confident with the formula and calculation. And this is where learners have to have confidence, and we've got to give them a lot of practice. Learners are often not able to distinguish between content. So we find that learners don't have a solid understanding of the fundamental competencies that they've been taught in previous grades. So we need to make sure that they know the basics and don't confuse concepts and terminology. Learners often don't show insight to deal with the questions based on things like compound angles and interpretive questions in the trigonometry content. So we need to make sure that we really consolidate. How do we help the learners? Well, the first thing we could do is we can make an effort to help the learners bridge any gaps in their knowledge from previous grades. We can also emphasize the importance of understanding the processes and not just learning steps off by heart. As teachers, we also need to emphasize the importance of reading the question carefully and in fact reading every single word. Make sure in the classroom we provide suitable examples of difficult concepts so the learners are easily able to distinguish between the terminology used, and make sure we use the terminology in the proper context on a daily basis. We need to support the learners in identifying the appropriate information to support their answer. Often the learners aren't able to support what they've actually written. And then, of course, making sure that the learners know, understand, and most importantly, are able to apply sections such as trigonometry. The fifth mistake that learners often make, and often this is due to circumstances at the end of the year, learners go off on holiday and come back and don't remember things from the previous grade. But as teachers, we need to make sure that we actually consolidate from the previous grade and build on this knowledge. Because learners struggle to show an understanding of work based on the previous grade. And then also make sure we build on previous knowledge. Use the knowledge from the year before that they can actually build on so they understand where it fits in. And of course, how do we help the learners do this? Most importantly, we need to ensure that all the essential topics and concepts that they need to build on for this year are consolidated from the previous grades. So these 5 common mistakes, although they mainly appear in the final matric exam paper, they obviously appear in grade 10 and 11, and we see a trend in the informal assessment and the formal assessments during these years. So as a teacher, we need to make sure that we help the learners and guide them not to make these mistakes and to prepare them better for the exams so they really get the results that they deserve.